So today we're going to talk about mainline Protestantism, how it developed into what it is today. Next week, we're going to talk about, in more detail than we have. We've talked about the Jewish influence, we've talked about the missionary influence. Today, I'm going to pull it together, okay? And next week, we're going to talk about evangelicals, okay, and how they reacted in response to what the mainline Protestants were up to. So the historical development of mainline Protestantism, what the author calls the apotheosis, it's like a transformation. It started earlier, but it really gained traction in the 1920s. Goes back that far. Okay, that mainline denominationals and evangelicals began to develop go down different roads. Okay. So I'm going to try to summarize. There's a lot of reasons for it. There's economic reasons, there's political reasons, and there's reasons based on foreign relations, believe it or not. Okay, but before we go into this, I think it's necessary to point out what happened to the post-World War II generation when they came home from the war. So they're leaving the cities, they're moving to suburbia. So now, all these big churches, I'll never forget the time Kirsten was going to medical school in Philadelphia, living right downtown. And the downtown in Philadelphia, parts of it are so preserved that you feel like you're going to run into Ben Franklin at any time. So we decided to try out some different churches. But these inner city churches now are almost dead because people don't live there anymore. Not the people who started those churches, right? So we go to this Lutheran church. This was such a traditional church. The pastor had this funny hat on with a little bun on top and a robe the likes of which I've never seen before. And it was like going back in time. It was really something. A real experience. The sanctuary was cavernous, but there was probably 20 people there. Yeah. Where are they all now? Well, they're all in suburban Philadelphia. They're in New Jersey, or they went west, out in the suburbs in Western Philadelphia. So they aren't living there anymore. Okay, so the result of that was that the Black population in the South thought there would be more opportunities and jobs and less discrimination. Remember, back then there were Jim Crow laws in the South, strict segregation. And so many Black families fled to the north. Unfortunately, when they got here, they found out that Northerners weren't any more hospitable than their Southern brothers and sisters were. So those empty row houses, okay, that emptied out when these big companies went out of business or moved overseas. Okay, steel companies, all of those big manufacturers, they all moved. Detroit, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh has rebuilt. It's now a financial center. Baltimore, New York was a special case because it's the financial center of basically the world. Okay, so New York, parts of New York obviously became ghettoized, but Manhattan itself remained wealthy. Philadelphia, all those big cities, the Black population from the South to escape segregation moved in. They took over those row houses, and those are the neighborhoods that became Black ghettos. Yeah. But in any case, my point is this. You've now got all these white people living out in these suburbs, okay? And there's no churches out there. There's tons of houses, thousands of people moving in. So what do the mainline denominations do? They send in mission developers. Nielsen was a mission developer. Mm-hmm. And what they did is they went knocking on doors. That's what they did. Inviting people to their church. The Methodists did it, the Presbyterians did it, the Lutherans did it, maybe with the exception of the Missouri Synod. I don't know if they did it or not. You know, Congregationalists, they all did it. That's why when you drive up and down the Alameda now, what do you see? You see an Episcopalian church, you see a Missouri Synod church, you see a Baptist church. What else do you see? A Mormon church. And at the end, there's a synagogue. Yeah. Okay. These churches were all built during that time when people were moving in here in probably the 60s, huh? 50s?
This church.
Yeah. 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 Now, there was one city in America that largely escaped white flight into the suburbs, and only to be the void to be filled with new Black residents who didn't find jobs and all the social problems that created, you know, the poverty and the drug abuse and of course the schools were hopeless. And I mean, there's one city that largely escaped this. You know which one it is? San Francisco.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. San Francisco remains, the neighborhoods in San Francisco, for whatever reason, people stayed in the city, they kept up their houses, and yeah, they didn't experience white flight like other cities did. Yeah. So, okay. So all of these churches are being built in the 50s and largely 50s and early 60s in all these new suburban neighborhoods. And that's why you can see so many churches all over the place in these different suburban neighborhoods. Back in those days, they were full. Why were they full? Well, they were full for a couple of reasons. Number one, the GIs, when they came back from World War II, those people were raised in Christian homes. America was, even though there was Jewish influence and there were Catholic neighborhoods too, it was still a mostly Protestant country. And Protestantism shaped this country from beginning to end. And that's because people came here, many of them, some for economic reasons, but many of them came here for religious freedom. And those were the Protestants that came here. Okay? So this country was shaped by Protestantism. Even if you look at the structure of our Constitution, it is based on Protestant theology. Do you know why the founders created 3 branches of government?
Checks and balances.
Exactly, because they believed all people are sinners. That's a Protestant doctrine. And if you put all the power into one branch of government, it will be abused. So you have to check and balance, because people follow their own self-interest, right? And if we had a president, God save us, who could do whatever he wanted, can you imagine? Okay, right now we've got the Supreme Court to say, no, that's unconstitutional. And we've got Congress who can override a veto if they have the votes. So, you know, they check and balance each other. That's all based on a perspective that comes from Protestant theology. Okay. All right, so that was one of the reasons. The other reason is they wanted to raise their children in the church. They wanted their kids to learn the Christian faith. They wanted their kids to learn their values, their morals, the way to live on the basis of the Christian faith. And so they wanted churches in their neighborhood so that they could raise their children in the church. And a third reason, of course, is social connections. I mean, when I was going to church as a kid, my parents, most of their friends came from the church we went to, except for our neighbors, of course, who went to different churches. But yeah, it was social connections as well. So the other thing to consider when you think about the fact that America was a Protestant country, think about back in the 19 well, we're in the 50s, let's just stay there. Okay, there was beginning to be far more Jewish influence, as we saw last time. All right, we had Kirsten and I the other day, we just wanted to watch Sound of Music again, so we did. That is a fantastic movie, man. That you know who wrote that? It's a Rodgers Hammerstein. They're Jews. Anyway, but if you wanted to be in a position of power in the government, in business, or in banking, you had to be a Protestant.
You had to be a Protestant.
You did.
You have to.
You did. The first president who was not a Protestant we had was JFK. And even then, in 1960, it was an issue. People argued about it. Oh, he's going to listen to the Pope. Remember that? Yeah. Yeah. So prior to him, they were all Protestants, every single one of them. Okay. And the bigwigs in business, okay, J.D. Rockefeller, what's the name of the guy that started that monstrous bank in New York? Chase. Chase was actually a member of Lincoln's cabinet. Yeah, he was. But I'm saying Morgan Stanley, all these people were Protestants. Yeah. And if you weren't a Protestant, you're less likely to move forward. That changed over time. And Jews find a way to succeed no matter what's happening to them. They find a way to succeed, okay? So anyway. Okay, so the typical person in the pews at this time, not the elites, denominational elites. The typical person in the pews when the churches were full in the 1950s were traditional Protestants. They came to church to educate their children. Let's take the Lutheran churches, okay? They came to church to make sure their child was educated in Luther's small catechism. They made sure their children went to Sunday school. They made sure their children went to church, and they went to church, and they felt a responsibility to be involved in the church. So most would volunteer, maybe not to be president, Marlis, but most would volunteer for something, you know. So the churches were thriving, and most of the people in the pews were just traditional American Protestants. Some were Democrats, some were Republicans, but back in those days, the rift between Democrats and Republicans was not as bad as it is today. Yeah, I mean, you could have a Democrat and a Republican. I know this because my family was split. Okay, could sit down and have a reasonable conversation about their differences of opinion without yelling and screaming at each other or getting up and walking out.
I'm not speaking to you.
Yeah, seeking a safe space. You can do that back then, but that's hard nowadays. Okay, that's hard. All right. But the reason it worked back then is because Democrats and Republicans held on to the same American values. They may have disagreed on policy, but their values were the same. All right. Okay. Things began to change in the 1960s, but I'm going to move forward. Now let's talk about the elites. Okay. What kind of people were they and what were they thinking about what the church was for and what it should be doing? All right. The denominational elites, first of all, you have to understand, number one, that they were highly educated. They had graduate degrees, most of them, not just a college degree, but a graduate degree, right? So they were shaped by the academic world, which is why they could reinterpret the biblical stories without giving up on scientific theories that seemed to differ from the biblical stories. They found ways to reinterpret the Bible. Okay, so they were more highly educated. Number one. Number two, they were progressives, and what I mean by progressives is that they were far to the left of most Democrats. Far to the left, okay? The people in the denomination, running the denominations, they were far to the left, all right? So their belief was that, okay, and they were shaped, like I said before, partly by Jewish influence, partly by what happened to the missionaries. The missionaries went overseas. Okay, and here's the initial mistake the missionaries made. I'm sorry. The initial mistake they made is that they were importing to other people, not just the gospel, but they were importing Western civilization as well. In other words, when a denomination decided that they were going to teach the Native American population here Christianity, they would put them in a classroom just like white children went to. Now, to Native Americans, that was foreign. To sit at a desk in a closed room, they lived in teepees. That was completely foreign. Number two, they had to learn a new language, English, couldn't speak in their own language. Oh, they would teach them the same hymns that we sing. In other words, Western music. Okay, now to a Lakota Sioux living in the Black Hills, what does Amazing Grace mean to him? That's not the kind of music they made. They made different music. We may find it odd, but to them that was normal, right? You know where it really worked when missionaries went overseas? It worked when they taught them the gospel and let them be Christians in the context of their own culture. Make their own hymns. Celebrate in their own ways. You go down to Central and South America now, and Christian festivals are celebrated in ways they'd never be celebrated here, with parades and I understand that in the Philippines, people actually allow themselves to be nailed to a cross on Good Friday. Yeah, they do. Yeah. Okay, so you see, the initial mistake was that they weren't importing Christianity, they were importing Western culture with it. If they had just stuck with teaching them the gospel, there would have been less tension and less the idea that Christianity is identified with white people. Well, Christianity isn't identified with white people. Christianity is for everyone, okay? So finally now that that's over with, the churches in other countries are growing. And they're celebrating in their own ways, okay? Whether you're Chinese or Filipino or whatever, okay? So, but that influence that the other peoples had over time on the missionaries was such that the Protestant elites began to think of Christianity not as, prior to that, they identified Protestantism with America. America is a Protestant country. Eventually it became Judeo-Christian because of the Jewish presence, but America was a Protestant country. The elites are now starting to think, no, that's not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is that Christianity is a global community, all right? Where everyone is included, not just people like yourself, okay? So, meanwhile, the average person sitting in the pew is sitting with who? Everybody who's the same as them, right? They're not sitting with, it's not a multicultural experience. As Dr. King said, it's the most segregated hour in America. So, so they started to think in terms of a global community, okay? And the other thing that really affected the elites was the progressivism of the so-called social gospel movement. Okay. So during the period of time when the Industrial Revolution was taking place, and this is before the factories moved overseas, they were being built here. Many Americans were employed in factories making cars, steel, refrigerators, everything you can think of. We were making it here, right? And the wages weren't good. Henry Ford prided himself, you know, because he paid people, do you know how much he paid them an hour? Or a day? Paid them per day. $5. But back then, that wasn't too bad. Yeah. Okay, so, but most places didn't, all right? So these people lived in, like I said, row houses or tenements or whatever. There weren't the child labor laws there are now. The working conditions were dangerous. And a guy named Walter Rausenbusch wrote a book called The Social Gospel. And basically what he said is that Christianity, sure, it's about your eternal salvation, but the focus ought to be on making this world a better place to live in. Look at what Jesus did. Look at what the apostles did. Okay? They ministered to people. They helped people in need. They addressed the problems of widowhood and being an orphan by including them in the community, feeding them and taking care of them. And so Walter Rausenbusch had a vision of a Protestantism that was active socially, changing the social fabric of our society so that everyone was taken care of. And then FDR came along and he gave a famous, I think it was his last State of the Union address, when he called for, do you remember what he called for? An economic Bill of Rights. Yeah, an economic Bill of Rights. In other words, everybody should be guaranteed a certain income. All right, well, most Americans, when they looked at that, saw communism or socialism, one of the two, and rejected it outright. That's not the way you create. Governments can't create wealth. Businesses create wealth. You have to have a free enterprise economy or you're not going to create wealth. You're going to go broke like the Soviet Union did. All right, so, but the progressives in the denominational offices, they bought into all of this stuff. And they wanted to reshape Protestantism, so they created what was called the Federal Council of Churches. And they had a place in Washington, D.C. And what do you think they did there? What do we call the people who try to influence legislation? Lobbyists, yes. They lobbied. They lobbied for legislation that would address social justice issues. That's what they did. Okay? They became the social justice warriors of their day. All right? And now Lutheranism is kind of an interesting case study because it's a little different than some of the other denominations. Lutheranism developed several synods, okay, by this time. The major ones were the Missouri Synod, they kept to themselves, okay? Then there was the ALC and the LCA. The LCA was the left wing of the Lutheran Church. The ALC tried to toe a kind of a middle road. They were still teaching their students new ways of interpreting the Bible and that sort of thing, but they were still trying to toe a more conservative route. All right. Now I'm going to jump ahead to 1972. Something major happened in 1972 among the denominations. You know what that is? Women were ordained. Yeah. Okay, the argument prior to that was Jesus chose only men as disciples. But If you read Romans, I think it's chapter 16, I mentioned it in the essay, you will notice that Paul says, greet, and he names all these women who are workers with him in spreading the gospel. All right, so that was the first big major change that the denominational elites got through, because, you know, it's a denominations meet in assemblies, and back in those days it was half clergy and half lay. Now it's mostly lay and a third clergy, I think. But back in those days it was half and half. Okay, the clergy would usually vote for the progressive policy, and lay people tended to vote more for the conservative policy, because not necessarily because they were conservative politically, but because they wanted to conserve the church the way it was. They liked the church the way it was, and they wanted to hold on to those traditions. Okay, and it was hard for them. I know it's not for you now. In fact, I'm pretty proud of the fact that my first call was to a church that was built in 1862. And when the senior pastor quit, they gave me his job. Now we needed an assistant, right? I talked him into calling a female assistant. And these were conservative people, but they grew to love her because she was so good at it. The kids just loved her, okay? So, but back then people had a hard time with the idea that a woman was preaching the gospel to them, teaching them their Bible studies and all of that. This was not the tradition of the past. Women didn't do that in the past. Okay, so it took a while to get used to it for a lot of people. All right. And then fast forward a little bit more. I got to this synod in 1994. And I started attending synod assemblies. You know what the big issue was?
It's,
No, that gay ordination. That's all they talked about. Ordaining gay and lesbian. That was it came up again and again and again and again. And it consumed the time of the synod assemblies. Okay. Now, I knew this might be coming because before I left Baltimore, the ALC came out with a study on the Bible and homosexuality. And they asked me to lead the study, okay? And anybody was invited. There were gay people there. There were very conservative people there. And I had the whole bunch, okay? Just to give you some idea of how tense the situation got when I was teaching this class, several of the gay members of the class went to the bishop and said, I think Pastor Severson's in danger. That's how tense it got. You better watch. Well, I wasn't in any danger, but you know, one of the really conservative members came up to me before class and he said, I don't think you ought to be teaching this. He said, when it comes to this issue, people around here he said, we're not fundamentalists, but on this issue we are. Okay, so in 2009, what happened then?
Gay ordination. Yeah.
The General National Assembly of the ELCA voted to ordain gays and lesbians who were in a committed monogamous relationship. It had to be a committed, because there wasn't gay marriage yet, and it had to be monogamous. Then you could be ordained. Okay. The denominational executives wanted it to go this way long before it happened, because they were out ahead of everybody. Okay. But it took the average Joe sitting in the pew more time to get used to the idea. Okay. So, and what do you think happened to the ALC, right, or to the ELCA right after that happened? Thousands of churches left the denomination, literally thousands. Now, many of them, if not most of them, were small Midwestern churches and Southern churches. I'm not sure that anybody around here left.
There's some people in our congregation who left.
Yeah. Yeah, and we lost a gal when, you know, the last bishop that was elected is a transgender person. And we lost a gal when that happened. Yeah. But the point I'm trying to make is that mainline Protestantism has become a progressive religious organization. Okay, they're more reflective of the culture, of where the culture has been going for a long time. And the Protestant, mainline Protestant churches have been tagging along. They're adopting the same
They certainly are.
ideas and values.
Before Luther.
Okay, so what we're going to do next week is we're going to look at, so what was the reaction to where Protestantism was going, mainline Protestantism? Evangelicalism was the reaction. And we're going to look at that development this week.